Hello everybody, my name is Caitlin and welcome back to my channel. It has been a minute since I've posted a review. I spent the last month moving into a new space. I have my new horror corner here. I'm not quite sure if I like the setup yet. We're still working on it. We're still making some changes, and I have this random plant here because I don't know where else to put it yet. But anyway, today I am giving my review of Insidious Chapter 5, the latest installment in the Insidious franchise. I plan for this to be a spoiler review, so just keep that in mind. However, if you don't want any spoilers, this is what I'll say right off the bat. I would put part 5 pretty much on par with part 4. Insidious is such a funny franchise where if I were to rank them from like best to worst, it would be in like the chronological order of the series. Like, I don't think any of the films in the series have ever topped the first one. I would say that for this film as well. I found this to be a pretty underwhelming conclusion. Saying conclusion because, as we all know, at this point in horror history, when a franchise comes out and says it's the final chapter, it's never the final chapter. My biggest problem with this film is the story. I actually feel like the premise of this film had a lot for them to work with. This is a film that follows the Lambert family from part 1 and 2. It jumps several years in time, so now the Lambert kids are all grown up. And the eldest son, Dalton, who was in a coma in the first film, he is getting ready to leave for college. There's a lot of interpersonal conflict within the family. You find out at the beginning that Patrick Wilson's character is actually divorced from his wife and has actually been pretty absent from the family. And he does not have a great relationship with his kids, especially Dalton, who just seems like he doesn't want anything to do with his dad. And I find that one of the really interesting things about the Insidious series, I went back and rewatched all of the films before I went to see this one. I actually hadn't seen any of them. I saw the first one when it came out in 2010, like 100 years ago now, but I never saw any of the sequels. So I went back and rewatched all of them in prep for this. And one of the things that stood out to me the most was this underlying theme of, in my mind, I refer to it as masculinity and crisis. There's just this underlying theme around like fatherhood and not being a good father, not being a good provider, and the kind of paranoia and anxiety that comes with that. Obviously, the series also comments on motherhood as well and the roles of mothers within families, but there is definitely a focus on the dads, right? Like, I think of Patrick Wilson's character in the first film, right, when the hauntings start happening around the house and he chooses to stay late at work, right, because he can't deal with what's happening in the house, and his wife is calling him and being like, hey, you need to come home, I need help, and he just doesn't want to deal with that. He doesn't know how to deal with it. And then, of course, his character's arc at the end of the first film is that he has to step up and go into the further and find his son. You have the third film, which, even though it is a prequel and has new characters, is still continuing this theme, right? You have the main female protagonist who has a strained relationship with her father. And then, of course, in the fourth film, you have the whole backstory with Lynn Shay's character and her dad, and learning that her dad was very abusive towards her. So Insidious has definitely had this underlying theme around fatherhood, around intergenerational trauma as well, and how oftentimes the demons that attach themselves to the humans are these kind of physical manifestations of this intergenerational trauma. And that continues very much in part 5 as well. Part 5 is, again, all about the father-son relationship and mending that. You also learn more about Patrick Wilson's father. So I think there was a lot of interesting ground for this film to cover. Unfortunately, while the film does set these ideas up, they don't really do much with them. My biggest critique about the Insidious franchise as a whole is just the weird pacing issues that these films have. They set up an interesting premise, they have interesting demons and interesting looks for all the various creatures that we encounter, but these films, while they often start off very strong, there's just something that happens after the beginning where it feels like there's a lot of filler scenes everything just kind of slows down a bit. And then you get to Act 3 where you have the big climax, and then it feels like everything is super rushed. It's like characters who have spent the whole film just meandering around and being like, I don't know what's happening. Suddenly in the last few moments, they're like, I know what to do. And it's all through exposition. They don't actually show anything. The final battles with the demons are usually not that satisfying. I feel like a lot of times it's usually like Lin Shaye's character just coming in and being like, "Be gone, demon," and then they just kind of float off somewhere. That's not to say that there are not good moments throughout Insidious 5. If you don't know, this film was actually directed by Patrick Wilson, who is taking his first time behind the camera. And I will say, like, there are scenes that are very effective. There are scenes where the tension really builds. I thought the opening of this film was very strong. There's also a scene that happens within an MRI machine. I mean, MRI machines are just kind of hell on earth in general. And that scene was very effective. I thought it was done really well. So I actually think he did okay with the material that he was given. I don't necessarily see this as a problem with direction as much as just a problem with the writing and the script, and there just not being a lot there for the actors to really do or grasp onto. You kind of have random demons that will just show up at certain points and they'll jump scare the characters. There's like one scene where one demon comes like crashing through a window. And again, you don't learn anything about them. That's the thing with the other films, is that, you know, there's always these creepy entities around. You don't really know what they are or who they are, but the film will usually set up by the end kind of what their purpose is. And here we don't really get that. And I know in the past the films have said like, oh, when you have like characters that are in the further and they're astral projecting and they're away from their bodies, like the demons can sense that, and so that's how they come out into, I guess, the real world. But that doesn't make sense here, because this happens, you see demons coming and again exploding through windows while characters are awake and not in the further and still have no recollection of even what the further is. So that didn't really make sense to me either. It felt like this film was kind of backtracking on its own rules that the series had set up. I was expecting the red devil guy, whatever his deal is, to show up and be more of a prominent figure as he was in the first film. But he's in this film for like maybe 3 minutes, if that. And I just felt like if this is the conclusion, if this is how you're going to end the series, I feel like it would have made more sense to have the demons that we've been familiar with, that the family's familiar with, to come back and start haunting them again, rather than all this kind of weird random stuff. I also felt like the characters needed to remember faster. A lot of the second act is like the son, Dalton, just kind of going around college and going to his art classes because he's an art student, and just kind of, you know, having certain visions while he's drawing. He doesn't really know what's going on. At the same time, you have Patrick Wilson, who is desperately trying to remember what has happened to him. He has memory issues. Neither of them really remember what happened in like the first and second films until there's a garbage truck outside making noise. Anyway, Patrick Wilson's character doesn't even remember the further until like way into the third act. You know, there's a scene where Dalton has once again been kidnapped by the red demon and is once again in his lair. It's very similar to in the first film when he was a child. At the same time this is happening, you have Patrick Wilson with Rose Byrne, his wife or ex-wife, and she's just kind of telling him through exposition like everything that happened in parts 1 and 2 of the film. I feel like this needed to happen way earlier. As the scene was taking place, I went to look at my phone because I was like, what time are we at in this movie? Like, we better not be at the end. And yeah, we were at the end. I think there was like 20, 15 more minutes left. And so again, we end up having a very rushed conclusion here. It would have been so much more interesting if Dalton going into the further and re-meeting the red demon, if that had been the film's like inciting incident, or just the end of Act 1, beginning of Act 2. And then the rest of the narrative is the family having to get back together, having to figure out how to re-enter this world. In some ways, it's like, what more can this series series do, because the stakes were already pretty high in parts 1 and 2, right? In part 1, you had the kid in the coma, and part 2, you had Patrick Wilson being possessed. So I get it to do another story where the son is just unconscious for most of it, or someone is possessed. Like, it already feels like we've seen this. However, I do think there are things that they could have done to work around that issue. There is a point where Dalton does become possessed by the demon for a few minutes. And one thing that I was thinking, like, with his character, what he seems to be struggling with is this thing from the past that he can't remember, right? He just has this cloudiness in his mind. And one thing that it reminded me of is like stories that you sometimes hear from people who had like near-death experiences, for example, right? They often say how difficult it is to come back from that, right? When you have kind of passed over and seen what's on the other side of what we're living in. And then to come back to our reality can be a very difficult transition. And I feel like given what Dalton went through with being in the coma and all of that, like they could have played with something like that, where he has this desire to go back into the further. He doesn't really understand what it is or why he has this, but he just doesn't feel comfortable in human reality. And it's this desire that causes him to eventually go back into it and to maybe be willing to get possessed by a demon or something. I don't know, that's probably a really like lame version of it, but something that they could have played with here. Rather than what they did, which again is just kind of characters running around in circles being like, something's happening to me, I can't remember. So yeah, the last like 15, 20 minutes, if that, it might even just be like the last 10 minutes, is Patrick Wilson going back into the further. His ex-wife conveniently has one of those, what are they called, metronomes? Those like ticking things that people listen to when they go under hypnosis. She has one of those and puts him under, and then he's back. And again, we don't really get any reaction from him about how it feels to be back and suddenly remembering everything that he's been spending this whole film desperately trying to figure out. He's there, saves the son, they defeat the demon in a pretty easy way. Patrick Wilson, he's at the red door, the demon is at the door, he's holding the door closed so the demon can't come out. Dalton returns to the real world and he goes to a painting that he has of the door and just paints like black paint all over it. And that helps conceal the door in the spirit realm as well. So that felt like a pretty easy conclusion there. There wasn't really much of a fight. And then as Patrick Wilson is still in the further, he encounters the ghost of his father. And again, throughout this whole film, they've set up that he has had a troubled relationship with his dad. He spent his whole life thinking that his dad had left him and his mom. And then it is revealed that his father actually killed himself. And the medical reports said that he was suffering from schizophrenia, although the film clearly hints that it wasn't schizophrenia, it was just, again, him astral projecting and messing with demons in the further. But essentially this idea that the father actually sacrificed himself, hoping that his family would live a better life than he did. And so when Patrick Wilson sees the ghost of his dad, I'm like, okay, so we're gonna get like a moment, maybe a moment of forgiveness. Again, he spent his whole life angry at his father, thinking that his dad left when actually something really tragic happened to him. And no, that doesn't happen. They just kind of look at each other for a few seconds and smile, and then that's it. And again, I was like, I feel like we needed something a little bit more, whether it was something where instead of Dalton just like painting over the red door, if it was something where Patrick Wilson's dad comes in and helps save the day somehow. Again, I know they've kind of done this in other Insidious films, but just in terms of like good narrative structure, okay, maybe we've seen it before, but I felt like the way that this narrative was going, they needed something like that to make the ending much more satisfying. Having two actors just staring at each other for a couple of seconds, not saying anything, isn't that satisfying. And it feels like it should be a big moment, but it's not. And that's kind of one of the weird things about this film in particular, is that the big moments are very much reduced down to nothing. Really, it's a problem throughout the whole series. So if you saw the film and you stuck around to the end credits, you know that it is hinted that this is not the final chapter. Again, that is not surprising as far as horror franchises go, and honestly, when I saw that ending, I was kind of glad to see it. I was like, good, I don't want this to be the final chapter because frankly, this is a very lame ending. So those are my thoughts on Insidious Chapter 5. Yeah, not one of my favorites of the franchise. If you've seen the film, let me know what your thoughts were. Did you enjoy it? Did you not? Let me know what you thought, and I will talk to you next time. Thank you so much for watching.